There is a moment, and if you have ever loved someone deeply enough, you know exactly what it feels like. When the world you thought you understood collapses into something so quiet, so still, and so devastating that no amount of money, no amount of success, and no amount of distance could have ever prepared you for it. This story is about one of those moments. It is about a man who flew across an ocean with a gift in his hand and tears already forming behind his eyes, not because he was sad, but because he had finally made it. He had finally done it. He had become the man he had always promised her he would be. He had a plan. He had rehearsed it 1,000 times somewhere over the Atlantic. He would knock on the door. She would open it, and he would say, "Mama, I'm home, and I brought everything I promised you." But when that door finally opened, the door to the house on the same quiet Georgia street where she had raised him, where she had pushed him, where she had believed in him before he ever believed in himself, what he found on the other side of that door did not match a single version of the moment he had imagined. Not one. His name was Elijah Cross, and on the night he came home, he was worth more than $300 million. Her name was Dorothy Cross, and on the night he came home, she was gone. Before we go any further into this story, and I promise you, this story is going to take you somewhere you are not ready for, I want to ask you something. When did you last call the person who raised you? Not a text, not a like on a photo, a call, a real one. Because Dorothy Cross had a son who called every single Sunday. He sent money every month without missing one. He believed, with everything in him, that love shown from a distance was still love. And what happened to Dorothy Cross while her son was thousands of miles away is not just her story. It is a warning for every single one of us. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what Elijah Cross came home to, you first have to understand what he came home from. Not just the success, not just the money, but the beginning. Because nothing about Elijah Cross's life was handed to him. Nothing about it was easy. And the woman at the center of this story, Dorothy Cross, was the single reason any of it was possible at all. Elijah entered the foster care system when he was 5 years old. His biological mother, a young woman named Patricia, had struggled most of her adult life with illness, poverty, and a set of circumstances that were not entirely of her own making. She loved her son the way desperate people love the things they cannot keep, with a ferocity that only made the loss harder. When Patricia died of a sudden cardiac event in the summer of a year that Elijah would later describe as the year the floor disappeared, he was placed in emergency foster care within 24 hours. He was too young to understand what was happening. He only knew that the person who smelled like home was gone, and that the places he was taken to afterward did not feel like anywhere he was supposed to be. 2 placements followed over the next 18 months. Neither was cruel. Neither was a home. Elijah was, by every account of those who worked with him during that time, a child who had learned to take up as little space as possible. He ate quietly. He slept quietly. He watched the world from a position so still and so careful that more than one caseworker noted in their reports that he seemed, at 7 years old, to already understand that the world was not particularly interested in making things easy for him. Dorothy Yvette Cross was 52 years old the morning she walked into a meeting with a caseworker and said she wanted to adopt. She was a retired middle school English teacher in a small town outside of Macon, Georgia. Her husband, Leonard Cross, had died 4 years earlier from prostate cancer that he had been too stubborn to treat until it was far too late. They had no biological children. Leonard had always said they didn't need them because the world was full of children who needed people like them more than the world needed one more baby born into a house that already had everything. Dorothy had waited 4 years after Leonard's death to do this. She had spent those 4 years grieving, gardening, teaching Sunday school, and sitting with a question that would not leave her alone no matter how many times she tried to set it down. The question was simple. It was the same question Leonard used to ask whenever they drove past a park full of children, and she would get that look on her face. He would squeeze her hand and say, "What are you waiting for?" She did not have an answer when he was alive. By the time she walked into that caseworker's office, she had finally found one. She was waiting for the right child. And the right child, it turned out, had been waiting for her too. The first time Dorothy Cross laid eyes on Elijah, he was sitting in a plastic chair in a hallway outside a caseworker's office, wearing a shirt 2 sizes too big and holding a library book he had already read twice. He did not look up when she walked past. She stopped anyway. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down in the chair beside him and asked him what his book was about. He told her. She listened. She asked a follow-up question. He answered. And something in the way that she listened, not the polite kind of listening, the real kind, the kind that makes you feel like your words actually matter, made 7-year-old Elijah Cross look up from that book and look directly into the face of the woman who would change everything about what his life became. He was placed with Dorothy 6 weeks later on a Tuesday in late September. She had repainted the spare bedroom the color he said was his favorite, a deep, warm blue, like the sky right before dark. She had put a bookshelf in the corner and filled half of it, leaving the other half empty for the books she fully expected him to accumulate. He walked into that room and stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. Then he turned to Dorothy and said, very quietly, "You saved me half the shelf." And she said, "The other half is yours to fill. Take your time." He cried that night for the first time since his mother died. And Dorothy sat outside his door and did not say a word, because she understood, with the particular wisdom of a woman who had also lost someone she could not replace, that some grief does not need an answer. It just needs someone nearby. Dorothy Cross was not a perfect woman. She was opinionated. She corrected your grammar. She had strong feelings about the proper way to iron a shirt, and an even stronger feeling that Elijah needed to read more nonfiction. She pushed him in the way that only someone who believes completely in what you are capable of can push you. Not cruelly, but relentlessly, in the way of someone who refuses to let you settle. She drove him to every academic competition he qualified for. She sat in every audience and never once made him feel like her attention was something he had to earn. When he got a full academic scholarship to study computer science at Georgia Tech, Dorothy Cross went to the school's front office the next morning and told them, with complete composure, that her son had just made history. The secretary, unsure what to say, asked which history she meant. Dorothy said, "The history of this family. That is the only one that matters." Elijah graduated and was approached by a technology accelerator in London within a year. The opportunity was real. The money backing it was real. The only thing standing in the way was 4,000 miles of ocean. Dorothy drove him to the airport herself. She did not cry until she was back in the car. He did not know that until much later. What she told him at the departure gate was this: "You go and you build something. You build something that lasts. And then you bring it home." He promised her he would. He left on a Thursday morning in the kind of September that still holds the heat of summer, but smells already like something changing. What followed over the next 14 years was the kind of success story that people reduce to a headline because the full version is too large and too complicated to hold all at once. Elijah Cross moved from London to Singapore, then to Dubai, then back to London, building a technology infrastructure company that specialized in financial systems for emerging markets. He was rigorous, focused, and relentless in the specific way that people become when they are building not just a company, but a proof. Proof that the boy in the too big shirt with the half-empty bookshelf deserved to be taken seriously by every room he had ever been made to feel small in. By the time he was 36, his company had been valued at over $300 million. By the time he was 38, that number had grown further still. He was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. And every Sunday, without missing one, he called Dorothy Cross. The calls lasted anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on what was happening in both of their lives. Dorothy always asked about the work, but rarely lingered on it. She wanted to know if he was eating, if he was sleeping, if he had found any good books lately. He always asked about the house, the garden, the neighbors, the church group she attended every third Wednesday. She always said everything was fine. She always sounded like herself, warm, dry, precise, and present. He sent money every month into an account he had set up in her name. He believed the money meant she was taken care of. He believed the calls meant he would know if she wasn't. He was wrong about both. The last call before he came home happened on a Sunday morning 14 days before his flight. He was in his apartment in London, already beginning to organize the homecoming in his mind. The flight, the gift, the ring, the look on her face when she opened the door. Dorothy answered on the third ring, the way she always did, as if she had been nearby, but not hovering. She sounded tired. He asked her if she was all right. She said she was just a little worn out, that the weather had been something else lately, that Pastor Gerald from the church had been by with a casserole. He smiled at that. He told her he had news, but he wanted to tell her in person. She said she had always liked surprises from him because he was one of the only people she had ever met who understood the difference between a surprise and a shock. They laughed. He said he loved her. She said, "I know you do, baby. I know." He did not know, as he hung up, that she was sitting in a house without hot water. He did not know that the electricity had been partially disconnected 3 weeks earlier. He did not know that Dorothy Cross, the woman who had repainted a bedroom blue for a child she had never met, was surviving on what remained of a situation that had been deteriorating, quietly, invisibly, and deliberately, for nearly 2 years. Elijah Cross landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport at 9:47 in the evening. He had a hired car waiting. He had a gift bag in his hand. Inside it, a small gold ring she had admired in a catalog 23 years ago and never purchased, and a certified bank check large enough to pay off her house, fund every remaining year of her retirement, and still have enough left to restore every room in the house to something she would love. He had rehearsed what he was going to say. He was not a man given to emotional speeches, but this one he had written in his head somewhere over the Atlantic and refined it quietly during the drive from the airport. By the time the car turned onto her street, his heart was doing something he hadn't felt in years. It was doing what it used to do when he was a boy walking down that same street, and seeing the light on in the window, and knowing that meant she was home, and that home meant him. The light was not on. He thought, initially, that she had gone to bed early. He knocked. No answer. He knocked again. Louder. The way you do when you're sure someone is home and just hasn't heard yet. No answer. The door, when he tried the handle, opened. He stepped inside and reached for the light switch. The overhead light did not come on. He used the flashlight on his phone. What he saw in that beam of light in the house where Dorothy Cross had raised him stopped him where he stood. The walls that she had always kept immaculate were showing the kind of wear that comes not from a single event, but from a long period of deferred maintenance. The kitchen counter held bottles of medication, some nearly full, some empty, all of them dated months before. The refrigerator, when he opened it, held almost nothing. There was no warm smell of cooking. There was no sound of a television in the back room. There was no Dorothy. Elijah Cross stood in the middle of that kitchen for a moment that he would later describe as the longest moment of his life. Then he began to move. He walked through every room in the house, calling her name, his voice becoming something he could not quite control. He checked the backyard. He checked the garage. He went back inside and sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she had helped him study for exams, where she had read the newspaper every morning, where she had told him once that the most important thing a person could do was to refuse to be diminished by anyone who had not taken the time to actually know them. He sat at that table, and he made the first call of what would become the longest night of his life. He called the neighbor directly to the right of Dorothy's house, a woman named Patricia Givens who had lived next door for over 20 years. Patricia answered, and her voice, when she heard who was calling, shifted in a way that Elijah noticed immediately. She said she was glad he had called. She said she had been wondering if anyone was going to come. She said she had not seen Dorothy in several weeks and that she had assumed, had told herself, had needed to tell herself, that Dorothy had gone somewhere to stay with family. He asked her if anything had seemed wrong before she stopped seeing Dorothy around. Patricia Givens was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have called someone. I told myself it wasn't my place. I should have called someone." He thanked her and hung up. He walked to the next house, and the next. Most neighbors confirmed they had noticed Dorothy's absence, but had assumed someone else was handling it. One neighbor said only that he hoped she was all right and closed the door. Another said she had thought the situation looked like a family matter and had not wanted to get involved. He knocked on the fourth door. It was answered by a man named Pastor Gerald Odom, a broad-shouldered man in his early 70s who had served the neighborhood church for more than 2 decades and whom Dorothy had described to Elijah on more than one Sunday call as the most decent man within 3 miles in any direction. Gerald opened his door, saw Elijah's face, and went pale. He stepped back and said, "Come inside." Elijah sat across from Gerald Odom in a living room full of family photographs and old hymnals. And Gerald, after a long pause, said the sentence that opened the first door in a night full of doors Elijah had never wanted to find. He said, "I was wondering when you'd come. I just didn't know how to reach you." Gerald Odom spoke for nearly 2 hours. He spoke carefully, the way men speak when they know the weight of what they are carrying and are trying not to drop any of it on the person sitting across from them. He laid out a timeline that, in its construction, dismantled every assumption Elijah Cross had made about the safety of the life he had been funding from a distance. Gerald said that Dorothy had experienced a significant fall approximately 18 months prior, a fall that she had not reported to Elijah, had downplayed to neighbors, and had refused to discuss with her church group in any serious way. She had been treated at a local clinic and released. She had returned home alone. She had told Gerald, when he pressed her, that she did not want her son disrupted. She did not want Elijah to feel obligated to come home before he was ready. She did not want to be a burden to the person she had spent 20 years specifically not being a burden to. After the fall, Gerald said, things began to change. Dorothy's health, which had been quietly shifting for some time, began to shift more visibly. She moved more slowly. She made fewer appearances at church. When Gerald offered to take her to medical appointments, she declined every time, saying she had things managed. What Gerald did not know, what no one in Dorothy's immediate community knew, was that she had received a diagnosis several months after the fall that she had chosen, with the particular quiet determination that had defined her entire adult life, to keep entirely to herself. She did not tell Elijah. She did not tell her church group. She did not tell Patricia Givens next door. She carried it the way she had carried everything difficult in her life, alone, internally, and without complaint, because Dorothy Cross had spent 52 years being the person other people leaned on and had never learned, or perhaps never allowed herself, to lean. And then Gerald said a name. It was not a name Elijah had heard in years. It was a name that, when spoken in the context of Dorothy's life, produced in Elijah's chest something between grief and a deep, cold clarity. The name was Renee. Renee Whitfield, Dorothy's younger sister. And the rupture between Dorothy and Renee was not a single event. It was, like most permanent family fractures, the accumulation of 100 smaller ones. Borrowing that became taking, taking that became assuming, assuming that became a pattern so deeply established that by the time Dorothy finally stepped back from it, the break felt not like a door slamming, but like a window quietly closing. Dorothy had lent Renee money on 4 documented occasions over a 20-year period and had received it back, if at all, in amounts that bore only a passing resemblance to what she had given. She had offered her home during Renee's various crises and had each time found the exit difficult to negotiate. By the time Leonard was dying, Dorothy had made the decision, quietly and without announcement, to stop making herself available to her sister in the ways she had been available before. The two women had spoken sporadically over the following decade, and not at all in the 4 years preceding the night Elijah sat across from Gerald Odom in the living room full of hymnals. Gerald said Renee had appeared at Dorothy's door approximately 6 weeks before Elijah's homecoming. He said she had arrived with bags. He said she had told the neighbors she was there to help her sister. He said that in the 2 weeks following Renee's arrival, Dorothy had become even harder to reach, less visible on the front porch in the mornings, less present at the mailbox in the afternoons, the curtains drawn in ways they had not been before. He said he had knocked on Dorothy's door twice in those 2 weeks, and that both times it had been Renee who answered, not Dorothy, and that Renee had assured him on both occasions that Dorothy was resting and was being very well taken care of. Gerald said he had wanted to push harder. He said he had told himself it was family business. He said, sitting across from Elijah with his hands folded in his lap, that telling himself it was family business was the mistake he would take with him for the rest of his life. By 1 o'clock in the morning, Elijah Cross had made 3 more calls. The third was to a private investigator in Atlanta he had used for business matters, a former law enforcement officer named Daniel Reeves, who agreed, given the circumstances, to begin working immediately. The fourth was to an attorney. The 5th call he made, at 1:14 in the morning, was to a number he had found in Dorothy's phone. A phone left behind in the house, sitting on the nightstand still connected to its charger, as if it had been left in a hurry or left without being taken. He called Renee Whitfield. She answered on the 2nd ring. Her voice was controlled, slightly defensive in the particular way of someone who has been expecting a call and has prepared for it. She told Elijah that Dorothy had wanted a change. She said Dorothy had found a place to stay that felt more comfortable for her health needs. She said it had all been Dorothy's decision. She said she had only been trying to help. And when Elijah asked her directly where Dorothy was, Renee said she would have to check on that and would get back to him in the morning. He said, very quietly, that there would not be a morning version of this conversation. Renee said she had to go. She hung up. Elijah Cross sat in his mother's car in the driveway of his mother's house and pulled over figuratively in a way that a man only does when the ground beneath him has entirely disappeared. And then, after a moment, he got back up, because Dorothy Cross had not raised a man who stayed on the ground. By the following morning, Daniel Reeves had begun pulling threads. The first and most significant one came not from a witness and not from a neighbor, but from the county records office. 3 weeks before Dorothy's disappearance from the house, 3 weeks, a document had been filed with the county registrar. It was a power of attorney. It had been signed, notarized, and submitted in proper form. It granted Renee Whitfield legal authority over Dorothy Cross's financial decisions and her property affairs. The signature on the document matched Dorothy's handwriting. The notarization was legitimate. On its face, the document was clean. The attorney looked at the date. Then he pulled a second document, a record from Dorothy's medical file, obtained with Elijah's legal authorization as her next of kin. The date of the power of attorney fell 6 days after Dorothy's second documented hospitalization at a regional medical center. The attending physician's notes from that hospitalization, notes made in the ordinary course of medical care, with no awareness of what would later come to matter about them, described Dorothy Cross as presenting with significant cognitive difficulty, disorientation consistent with advanced illness progression, and reduced capacity for complex decision-making. In plain terms, on the day Dorothy Cross had signed over legal control of her life to her estranged sister, her own doctor had documented that she may not have been fully capable of understanding what she was signing. Elijah's attorney set the documents on the table between them. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then the attorney said, "Someone was watching and waiting for a window, and when the window appeared, they moved through it." The investigation over the following 72 hours revealed a picture that was, in its construction, both methodical and devastating. Using the power of attorney, Renee Whitfield had redirected Dorothy's monthly pension payments to an account Renee controlled. She had engaged a real estate agent to evaluate the house that Elijah had been sending money to support for 14 years, the house that held every photograph, every piece of furniture, every quiet corner of a life Dorothy Cross had built with her own hands after Leonard died, and had taken preliminary steps toward listing it for sale. She had canceled Dorothy's scheduled medical appointments. She had stopped paying the utility accounts. She had, over a period of approximately 4 weeks, systematically dismantled the infrastructure of Dorothy's daily life, while presenting to the outside world the appearance of a devoted family caretaker. What she had not done, what she had perhaps not anticipated, was that the man sending money every month was not sending it blindly. Elijah Cross had, years earlier, established a separate account in Dorothy's name that required dual authorization for any transfer above a certain threshold. Renee had not known about this account. She had redirected the pension. She had not been able to touch the larger fund. It had sat untouched through the entirety of the preceding 6 weeks, accumulating the same monthly deposits from Elijah's accounts in London, waiting. It was the one thing Renee Whitfield had not managed to reach, and it would later become the basis for the financial restitution proceedings. When investigators located Dorothy Cross, she was alive. She was 40 minutes outside of town, in a low-income adult care facility that accepted Medicaid reimbursement, a facility that was functional and staffed, but that was, by every objective measure, far removed from the warmth and dignity and particularity of the life Dorothy Cross had lived and deserved to continue living. She had been placed there by Renee 5 weeks earlier. She had been given no phone. She had received no visitors in the time she had been there. Staff noted in their records that she asked, regularly and consistently, about her son. She asked if anyone had called him. She asked if there was a way to reach him. She did not know he was already home. She did not know he had been looking for her since the night he landed. She did not know that 40 minutes away, in the house with the blue bedroom and the half-empty bookshelf, a man who had crossed an ocean to surprise her was turning the entire county inside out to find her. Elijah Cross walked into that facility on a Tuesday morning. He had not slept in 48 hours. He had not eaten anything of consequence since the flight. He was accompanied by his attorney and by Daniel Reeves. But when they reached the common room and the staff member pointed to a woman seated near the window, Elijah stopped walking and stood still for a moment in the doorway. Dorothy Cross was sitting in a chair near a window that let in the morning light. She was wearing a house dress that was not hers. She was looking out the window at nothing in particular, the way people look when they have been waiting long enough that they have stopped expecting what they are waiting for to actually arrive. She heard footsteps and turned her head. She looked at the door, and in the space of a few seconds, 3 staff members would later describe it to investigators as among the most affecting things they had witnessed in their professional careers. Dorothy Cross's face moved through something that had no clean name. Recognition, disbelief, relief, and something that was older and quieter than any of those things, the particular expression of a woman whose faith in a specific person had never actually left her, even when the waiting had become almost unbearable. She said his name. He crossed the room, and Elijah Cross, a man worth more than $300 million, knelt down in front of the chair where his mother was sitting and held her hands and did not say a single word for a very long time. Because there was nothing to say that her hands and his did not already say better. What followed in the legal proceedings was not fast, and it was not simple, but it was, in the end, thorough. The power of attorney was formally contested in court on the grounds of Dorothy's documented cognitive state at the time of signing. Medical experts retained by Elijah's legal team reviewed the hospitalization records and provided testimony that the signing had taken place during a period of measurable cognitive impairment. The court agreed. The power of attorney was invalidated. The pending real estate listing was frozen and subsequently withdrawn. The redirected pension payments became the basis for a civil restitution claim. And Renee Whitfield, who had constructed her defense around the claim that everything she had done was with Dorothy's full knowledge and consent, found that defense increasingly difficult to maintain as the documentary evidence mounted against it. Criminal charges were filed by the county prosecutor's office under elder financial exploitation statutes that, as legal advocates would later note in coverage of the case, had been strengthened in recent years precisely because cases like Dorothy's had become so prevalent and so devastating. The charge carried potential prison time. The case moved through the court system over the following 14 months, with Dorothy Cross present for the significant hearings, sitting in the front row, wearing one of her Sunday hats, which had always been her particular form of personal armor against anything the world tried to use to diminish her. The verdict, when it came, was not a surprise to anyone who had been following the proceedings closely. Renee Whitfield was found guilty on multiple counts. Restitution was ordered, jail time was assessed, and the judge, in sentencing, made remarks that were later quoted in coverage of the case, and that Dorothy's attorney said he intended to use in every future proceeding of this type. The judge said that what had been done to Dorothy Cross was not a family dispute. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a predatory act carried out against a woman whose only real vulnerability was that she trusted too much and asked for help too little. He said the law existed for exactly this purpose and that the court intended to use it. Elijah Cross sat through the sentencing without visible expression. Afterward, outside the courthouse, he said only that he was grateful for the outcome and that he intended to make sure his mother never needed the protection of a court again. He was asked by a reporter if he felt justice had been served. He looked at the reporter for a moment and said, "Ask me again in 5 years, when my mother is back in her house and her garden is growing and her books are back on the shelf. That's when I'll know what justice looks like." Dorothy Cross returned to her home on a Thursday afternoon in the early spring following the trial. Elijah had spent the preceding months directing a complete renovation of the house. Every system repaired, every room restored, the garden replanted. He had hired full-time, vetted, professionally supervised in-home care. He had transferred the certified bank check he had been carrying since London, the one from the gift bag, the one for enough money to fund every remaining year of her life, into an account structured in a way that no single person, including himself, could redirect without a documented authorization process from Dorothy herself. Patricia Givens was on the front porch when Dorothy arrived. So was Gerald Odom, who had spent the months since the trial doing what he would later describe as penance, visiting the elderly members of his congregation more frequently, asking harder questions, refusing to accept the word fine as a complete answer. Several of Dorothy's former students, women now in their 40s, some of whom had driven hours to be there, were standing in the driveway. One of them had brought flowers. One had brought a casserole. One had brought a book she had wanted to give Dorothy for years and had never found the occasion for. Dorothy Cross walked up the front steps of her house slowly, using the railing that had been reinforced as part of the renovation. She stood at the top of the steps and looked at the people in front of her, and at the house behind her, and at the garden that was already beginning to come back. Then she looked at Elijah, standing to her left, and she said, quietly and without ceremony, "You took long enough." He laughed. She laughed. And then she went inside, and the house was full again. In the months following Dorothy's return, Elijah Cross established a foundation in her name focused on elder care advocacy in underserved communities across the American South. The Dorothy Cross Foundation specifically targets the gap between the existence of protective systems and the reality of whether those systems reach the people who need them most. It funds legal advocacy for elderly adults facing financial exploitation, community education programs designed to help neighbors recognize and report warning signs, and emergency intervention resources for cases where the window between exploitation and irreversible harm is closing fast. He relocated his base of operations to Atlanta. He has not missed a Sunday call since. The calls are shorter now because he no longer needs them to be his only window into her world. He can drive there. He does drive there. Often on Sundays, after the call, he simply gets in the car. There is a number that stayed with me as I researched this story and that I want to leave with you before we close. Researchers have found that only 1 in 44 cases of elder financial exploitation is ever reported. 1 in 44, which means that for every Dorothy Cross whose story reached a courtroom, there are 43 more whose stories are still unfolding in houses on quiet streets in towns where everyone assumed someone else was paying attention. The National Adult Protective Services Association estimates that 90% of elder abuse is committed by family members or trusted individuals. Not strangers, not outsiders. People who know the combination to the safe. People who know which neighbor is least likely to ask questions. People who know that a woman who has spent her entire life refusing to be a burden is the least likely person in the world to pick up the phone and say that something is wrong. Dorothy Cross did not pick up the phone. She asked after her son every single day for 5 weeks in a care facility 40 minutes from home. She asked quietly, the way she had always done everything that mattered most to her, without demands, without theater, with only the particular faith of a woman who had always known, even when the evidence was thin, that the people she loved would eventually find their way back to her. She was right. He did. But she should not have had to wait. Elijah Cross gave one recorded interview in the 6 months following the trial to a regional outlet that covered the legal proceedings. The journalist asked him what he would say to other people in his position, people who were building something far away, sending money home, believing that the calls and the transfers and the good intentions were enough to constitute presence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said this, "I thought love was something you could maintain across distance if you were consistent enough. I thought showing up financially was a version of showing up. I was wrong about that. Not completely wrong, but wrong enough to matter. The money kept the lights on until someone figured out how to turn the lights off. What would have kept my mother safe was someone who actually saw her. Someone who was close enough to notice when the curtains were different. I was not that person. I was the person who sent checks. And for a long time I confused those two things." He paused. Then he said, "She knew I'd come. She told me, later, that she never stopped believing I would come. She just didn't know it would take so long." He looked at the journalist. "I didn't have anything to say to that. Because she was right. It took too long. And the only thing I can do now is make sure I never confuse sending for showing up again." The gold ring, the one from the catalog, the one she had admired 23 years ago and never purchased. Elijah placed it on her finger the afternoon she came home. She looked at it for a long time. She said she remembered the catalog. She said she had looked at that page more than once. He asked her why she had never bought it. She said, "Because some things are better when they come from someone else." He nodded. She held his hand. Outside, the garden was beginning again. Inside, the bookshelf in the blue bedroom, the one she had left half empty for the books she always knew he would accumulate, was finally full. "Before we close tonight, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it rather than scroll past it. Is there someone in your life, a mother, a grandmother, an aunt, A neighbor who has been part of your world for so long you have stopped really looking at her. Who you have been meaning to check on. Not text. Not like. Check on. Really check on. Drive over. Knock on the door. Ask the question and then stay long enough to hear the real answer. Not the one she gives to make you feel better about leaving. Dorothy Cross had a whole community around her. She had a neighbor of 20 years. She had a pastor she trusted. She had a son who called every Sunday and sent money every month. And she still almost disappeared. Not because the people around her did not care, but because caring, without presence, without the particular willingness to push past the word fine and stay until you find the truth. Caring like that leaves gaps. And there are people in this world, people who look exactly like family, who know precisely how to move through those gaps. Do not let someone you love become a story someone tells. Do not let the quiet ones be the ones who suffer quietly. Check on your people. The real ones. The ones who would never ask you to. Next week, we are bringing you a story about a woman who spent 11 years convinced she was a widow, attending her husband's memorial, grieving his absence, building a new life from the rubble of loss. Until the afternoon, a stranger knocked on her front door with a photograph and 3 words that unraveled everything she thought she knew. You will not see this ending coming. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss it. We will see you then.